I first learned to paint in watercolor, not from a Western perspective, but I took an Asian art course in Sumi painting from Horseshoe, North Carolina, called Asian Art Course, and I found myself loving drawing with the brush, and that's what Sumi is, drawing with the brush. And I found myself using the inks and then the watercolors, the Sumi watercolors. And fortunately, in Carmel, in the art store, one of the art store where I was working in Carmel, they had a box of the Sumi watercolors in the saucers. So I was able to learn through that. Then I learned when I was 18, I worked with Sam Colburn on weekends doing watercolors with him, the famous watercolorist. And that was a Western approach, but very loose Western approach. I find myself with watercolor, the brushes are so important because the response is so quick in watercolor. The way I work it, because of how I learned with the Sumi, but also how I learned with Sam Colburn, and more flooding possibilities. And when I work with watercolor, I like to make the colors flow and have a softness and a strength, both playing the two against each other, not having a flatness, but a layers. So I work in layers, in quick layers that are giving me a chance to see the depth that I wouldn't get if I just hit it once. So I take the Sumi approach of the quick shot, but then I take the layers approach of the Western. So I mix the two together and I get my watercolors. My watercolor subjects are right now, of course, are mainly the heads that I've been working on and trying different combinations of colors that make a unit. So I want a very unified feeling in my watercolors, and in my traditional watercolor approach, when I'm using my watercolors as a sense of expression. You see in the book, this is the different ways of working. I scrape here, or I scrape back into the color. Here, where I put many layers on top, and then go in with more layers, and then here, with the pencil marks showing, which is also a particularly Western tradition that they used to do in the English Society of Watercolor Painters, would sometimes have the pencil showing. My trees are the softness of the trees. These are trees that are in Mexico, and you can see on these where I'm using the same colors, but different in the same kind of tones, but then I darken it, and I always go from light to dark. That's a traditional watercolor approach in Western art. And the Eastern art, the brush is loaded with a dark at the tip and a light more water at the top of the brush. So the transition in the Asian art or Sumi painting is that. Here I would have more of the bold pencil, the heavy graphite pencil, and in the watercolor showing each other. Here I just have the watercolors straight. Here it's mostly a drawing, but I just use the watercolor to put in the shading. But here, I go into the extreme, many layers. This is at least 6 layers to get that effect that's in the back, and then the head is in there. There's many layers in the head, and then I blot out, and I blot out with tissue paper or Kleenex. Okay, this is the COVID watercolors that I did when I was sitting it out in here in my studio, avoiding a lot of social contact outside of the deli and a few other places that I eat. And these are all smaller watercolors. Using a variety of techniques. Watercolor for me is wet. It's always wet. And for me, I'm not interested in dry brush, which is another technique that looks more like tempera. And the dry brush technique is literally as it sounds. You don't put a lot of water on the brush, just enough to make the paint move. And I get a variety of tones using instead of my usual India ink, and this I use the carbon black, the ivory black, and some lamp black, and let it the grays soften and then darken, and then come in here with the tissue paper where I wipe it out back to the white. When we're looking at the series where it's 2 people, we have a variety of textures on each person, each character in each shape. So none of these aren't necessarily traditional watercolor techniques, but I use them. I use only watercolor. When I got more monochromatic, I did a lot of monochromatic heads in here, and just a slight darkening of the same color. These are actually the darkest reds I could make, but using the reds. Here I scrape in, and here I let it float. In other words, a lot of water. This is less water, this is more water. And this is monochromatic here. On these larger pieces, I play with the black, the lamp black, the softer black, and on the soft blotted out gray blue back here, and then the soft blue behind that. So again, I'm working in layers. Here, I'm working on a lot of layers as I come into the parts of the face, the mouth, the eyes, the side of the nose, things like that, becoming thicker. Not thicker, but less water. Here you can see a bounce where I play off on that, and I bring the colors in, and the last colors that go on are this bright blue, and that's highlighting those areas. Then over here is just variations of how these techniques work, and on these small, again, these are small watercolors that I could do at my watercolor table. Back here is where I put the background on first, and then I paint into the background, and that's what this stripping back here is I'm using the texture of the wide brush to get that texture. sometimes I bounce the same color off, playing it in two different shapes, but letting have a life of its own too at the same time. Here I scratch in with my house painter's decorator scratchers, and scratching in also with a palette knife into the watercolor. Again, these are all watercolors. There's no acrylic in these. So I'll make some hair over here with those scratchers and things. Hair in here. Many times I let the color bleed out to out past the line or out past the form, so it becomes like a reflective color. So that's what's happening on this piece right here, and that sets a different mood, and that's like what they used to call open color. Here's a combination of a scratching, and this is tissue paper wrapped up to make a texture on the face, and I pushed that on my watercolor. When we look at the history of watercolor, the old master of watercolor was Turner, the English early 19th century painter. Mostly the battle scenes of the great ships and all that of the British Navy, which was then ruling the waves of the world. And that was his main commission pieces, were done that way. But his little watercolor notes, which he made 140 some odd thousand little notes on sometimes just 3 pieces of color on the paper, are very naturally abstract. We don't understand exactly how Turner's mind worked, except that we know that he had a very great interest in the new theory of triads, color triads of Chevreul, and he had other interests in terms of keeping the watercolor very wet. He and Constable were always were friends, but they were competing against each other in who had the most luscious landscapes in watercolor and in oils. But in terms of watercolor, Turner was the real master of the loose and free, and a lot of our modern color watercolorists come from Turner, the influence of Turner. The British Royal Society of Watercolor artists, much tighter, much more what we used to call academic, and very heavy pencil drawing first, and then colored the pencil drawing. Later they came into, after Turner, they come into a little looser use of the paint. Watercolor is one of the oldest mediums in the world, and it's the simplest piece of technology. It's pigment, gum arabic, and water, and that's it. So you can make it. You can make your own watercolors pretty easy, and companies like Daniel Smith, they make the watercolors that are very, very expensive but very beautifully made. And Winsor Newton, the big art company in England, still makes the traditional watercolors and looks for new colors as well as Daniel Smith does. We're looking at Schmanke, the German company, there's another one that's very good, and the French Lafroc-Bourget and Sennelier. These are all the great watercolor companies, and there's Korean companies, there's Japanese companies like Yasutomo, but the real masters of watercolor are water. That is, the ultimate master of your watercolor piece is the water, and how the colored water works. So give yourself a chance to do this and let the water flow until your colors will flow. If the water doesn't flow, the colors don't flow.